Hello, Greg, thanks very much. I suppose I'm thrilled to be having the chance to speak to you today in the context of health, because so often architecture is discussed only in terms of the arts and loveliness and niceness, but its implications are massive. And so I wanted to really talk about the crisis that I believe has happened over the last almost a century. And that crisis has been because of a mindset problem in the world of the construction industry and development, and the prioritizing of the insides of buildings and not enough attention being given to the outsides of buildings, which might seem like, no, surely that's not the case, and all this, people only care about outsides. But actually, almost every new building you go into, the inside's pretty good daylight, you can get around. But the question is, what does the outside contribute to society? And when we look at the numbers of people involved, there are 1,000 times more people who will not go into any new building. We're very privileged people. This is an amazing new building. 1,000 times more people will go past this building than will ever come inside it. And so within this challenge, I believe the biggest part of it is the ability of the creators of this world around us to put themselves in the shoes of others. Instead of just thinking about their own creative ideas and cost parameters and all of those things, can you use your imagination to imagine how others will feel? And if we start to really look at what we've all got so used to, in a sense, it's like death by 1,000 cuts. We've just got so used to buildings like this being built. And where you think, well, who would be sad if this building is demolished? And buildings like this in Italy, where you'd sort of think, would you want to go on a date outside these buildings? Or buildings like this in Singapore, where you say, well, would the person who designed this actually want to live here? And so I believe we've got a problem. And instead of talking about beauty, which is too often used, and then people can say, oh, well, that's subjective. The challenge is that buildings are the backdrop of society's life. And we have this time when, in the digital era, a friend of the studio wrote a book called The Lonely Century. And just that title breaks your heart, because the digital technologies that were supposed to democratize, allow us all to see each other, have divided us. And what are we left with? Public life, as we know on X. You look at the toxicity of how people interact with each other, often anonymously. So what's interesting is the rooms of our public life, the walls of those are the buildings that are built, whoever's inside them. And so this key word, and I know it's a really disappointing word, it's kind of rubbish word, but boring is a useful word. And if we start to look, well, what do we mean by boring in relation to buildings? We've just had buildings, one by one, again and again, that are too flat, too plain, too straight, too shiny, too monotonous, too anonymous, too serious. Like, what happened? Now, sometimes it's really appropriate to be shiny. Sometimes it's really appropriate to be smooth or repetitive. But it's a bit like snorting too much cocaine, drinking too much alcohol, taking some mushrooms, too much alcohol, ketamine or whatever it is. It's the combination. And so what we've realized as we started to speak to neuroscientists and really research this isn't a niceness problem. This is something that's actually neurological and psychological in how we experience the world around us. And this isn't just a question of niceness. There's actually harmful boring, which sounds like a funny mix of words, but bear with me. But there are researchers now who've been examining this, and trying to move away, because at the moment we've had an industry that tells itself the story that the public are ignorant. They don't understand. And that beauty is all subjective. And we have that again and again and again. And in fact, there was a debate of elite people in the construction industry a few years ago discussing, do the opinions of the public matter? And they debated all night and had a nice drink and had a meal, and then they voted. And they voted that they don't. Unbelievable. So there are researchers like Colin Ellard in Canada who've been moving away from just asking people their opinions, but putting sensors on their bodies where you can actually read the level of stress in people's bodies, and finding that the people who are witnessing the building on the left, who are there outside it, feeling it, their bodies start to go into stress. And the buildings on the right, the opposite is happening. So what was so interesting was there was none of the conditioning of your education necessarily was impacting that. That's just literally your body's like a fight or flight instinct when something has nothing for your mind to connect to. And so there's also this other dimension we have to talk about, which is the dirty secret of construction, which is that the climate crisis that everyone knows, everyone is starting to really feel. Strangely, what I've just been talking about has a massive impact on that. The buildings, unless they are cared about enough by society, will be demolished. And I've been to so many symposium-y types of things and stood there, and professional teams have spoken about how incredibly sustainable their building is. And they talk about how it uses minimum energy and one light bulb can heat it for 10 years and all of these things. You go, wow, 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 that's amazing, amazing, amazing. And then you stop and just think, but it's horrible and it's boring and I'll demolish it tomorrow. And so, but the problem is the teams who create aren't the teams who actually decide what gets demolished. And so the demolition is the dirty secret. In the US, 1 billion square foot of buildings are demolished every year. That's half of Washington, DC, destroyed to just get rebuilt with no less lovable buildings, typically. And in the UK, we demolish 50,000 buildings a year to rebuild them again. And so the average age of a commercial building in the UK is 40 years. So if I was a commercial building, I would have been killed 14 years ago. So who would have thought the construction industry is responsible for 5 times the greenhouse gas emissions as the aviation industry? But I bet you've all spoken about the aviation industry and discussed whether you should travel and whether you should fly somewhere or not. But because people feel powerless about buildings, society doesn't talk about the buildings. And just to give you a sense of perspective, it uses 4 kilos of carbon to make a Big Mac. And a building, so if you imagine this as the book, which is sort of this size, normal penguin size, double page spread, this is showing it takes 250 tons of carbon to put a rocket into space. But to build a tower in the City of London, which by global standards isn't a very big tower, takes the equivalent, it's 92,000 tons of carbon, which is the equivalent of 23 million Big Macs, which is the equivalent of my little book of another 10 meters further. That's the entirety of this stage beyond on this graph. So we are not seeing the vast impact. And so just as we've got used to the idea of fast fashion, and then we've also been discussing, and the problems with that, and we've been talking about the problems with things like turkey Twizzlers, the nutritional value of what we give our children. We haven't been paying attention to the nutritional value to society of the buildings that are around us and what our brains actually need to be nourished by the world around us. So I believe it's become normal in the construction industry to talk about the green premium, and no self-respecting board of any big industry can get new office space unless they know that environmentally its credentials are good. But we're not really fully exploring what is good for the environment, because without the human premium, I don't believe we are actually doing what we want to be doing, which is making really sustainable places. And that's about being good broadly for society. And so the world of construction talks about form follows function. Less is more. Ornament is a crime. It's lovely, it's powerful. When you're studying, that goes in your brain and brainwashes you fully. But I believe, me and my team and the people who I believe are good are functionalists. Form does follow function, but emotion is a function. And that is not celebrated in the world of construction. It's very high in head, but not necessarily hand and heart. And I think there's an immense opportunity. And I know how my studio is lucky to do a few projects every year, but in the big scheme of things, it's nothing. Our challenge is to change the debate and discussion in society and to stop people feeling so powerless at scale, because we actually need 1,000-year thinking. We can't have buildings that are only for 40 years. In Seoul, they're 30 years in the city. In China, residential buildings, the average age is 34 years. It's ridiculous. So how do we make buildings that we want to adapt and adjust and repair instead of demolish? So I believe we've got to start experimenting with what's the language to make humanized places. And that's about caring for the people who will never come inside your building, that you may never make any money from by the creation of your building. That's about something broader and being in public service in your role as a professional in the construction industry. So how do we make buildings that can just hold your attention for the time it takes to walk past them? Doesn't sound like much, does it? But so many buildings, you just kind of go glass, dum, down, back to your phone. So what we've learned is that the brain actually needs a level of fascination. And that less is not more. We need complexity. There's a reason when you look out into a forest, there's this thing called attention restoration theory that Rachel and Stephen Kaplan developed, which is understanding that looking into nature and all that complexity, but with rhythms, restores your attention back again. And we need that in buildings. So I'm urging us to sort of think about buildings by looking at the different scales of impact, at the city distance, at the street distance, and at the door distance. And most local authorities, they have a policy for city distance, how to make buildings that it's perceived will be good for society. Same with street, but door, there is no obligation, it sounds silly, obligation to fascinate. Obligation, how do we unleash? Buildings used to have the creativity of people, many, many people, and we've ended up putting so much responsibility onto the role of building designer and all sorts of forces, which there aren't time to go into now, that have meant that arguably the most cost-effective place, door distance, it costs so little, and yet that's where we all are. We're not in helicopters looking down at buildings. So I feel very honoured to have the chance to address a group of people who are passionate about health, because I do believe that this isn't a question of niceness. This is actually a question of the health and mental health. And we talk about mental health now. Even royals talk about mental health. Footballers talk about mental health. But we don't talk about the mental health impact of buildings for all of us. And that's why my studio is trying to start, has begun a campaign influenced by the book. And anyone who's interested who could add their expertise, the science is at an embarrassingly early stage. This is one of the biggest industries ever in history. And we are urbanizing massively. Half the world's population live in cities. By 2050, 70% will live in cities. And if we have the lonely century, because the environments around us aren't conducive to bring us together, our streets won't be safe. And civility breaks out when we are actually together, and it reduces that hatred that we can so easily see on social media such as X. So thank you very much, and anyone who'd like to be involved, please contact us.